Watchtower teaches that 1914 is the year that began Jesus' invisible presence and his rulership in heaven. Before demonstrating why that's impossible, let's first walk through how Watchtower arrives at the year 1914. This extrapolation can be found in the Bible Teach Book, published by the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. The Bible Teach Book first cites Jesus' words at Luke chapter 21 verse 24, where he says, "Jerusalem will be trampled on by the nations until the appointed times of the nations are fulfilled." Watchtower teaches that the appointed times of the nations means the time period during which God would not have a king representing him. While Israel was a sovereign nation, it was Israel's king that represented God. The book then goes on to claim that God's rulership began to be trampled on by the nations in 607 BC when Jerusalem was conquered by the Babylonians. It then points to Daniel's interpretation of the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar's dream. In this dream, the king saw a great tree grow so large that it was visible from anywhere on earth. Then an angel came down from heaven and commanded that the tree be chopped down and bound for 7 times. Daniel tells the king that the tree represents him at the height of his power in Babylon, and that the king would lose his sanity and act like an animal for 7 times, living in the field and being fed vegetation like a bull. God would do this to teach Nebuchadnezzar humility, since as verse 30 shows, Nebuchadnezzar was anything but humble about his power and majesty. Once humbled, Nebuchadnezzar would then be restored to his throne. Watchtower says that the tree doesn't only symbolize Nebuchadnezzar, but also God's rulership on earth as represented through the kings that ruled in Jerusalem, and that tree was chopped down in 607 BC when Jerusalem was conquered by the Babylonians. Watchtower also says that the 7 times represents 2,520 days. They base this on Revelation chapter 12, which says that 3.5 times equals 1,260 days. Well, if 3.5 times is 1,260 days, then 7 times must be twice that, or 2,520 days. They then jump back to Numbers and Ezekiel and apply what they find there, where it says 1 day represents 1 year. Watchtower calls this a rule, and applies that rule so that the 2,520 days now represents 2,520 years. If you add 2,520 years to the fall of Jerusalem in 607 BC, you arrive at 1914 as the year the appointed times of the nations ended, and God once again had a representative king, Jesus. Let's walk through each of the points Watchtower uses to make this extrapolation and see why it's all nonsense. The biggest problem with Watchtower's extrapolation is that it requires Daniel chapter 4 to have a meaning that it simply doesn't have. Nowhere in the book of Daniel or anywhere else in the Bible is there any indication at all that the huge tree being bound for 7 times applies to anything or anyone but King Nebuchadnezzar himself. Watchtower doesn't claim that any of the other prophecies in Daniel have 2 fulfillments, just the one in chapter 4. Why? Based on what are they claiming that Daniel 4 has 2 fulfillments? What scriptural evidence do they use to get to this belief? There is none. Why don't the other prophecies have multiple fulfillments? We're not told. All of this shows that this extrapolation is just a fanciful idea of a group of men who want to force the Bible to prove their own end times chronology. So that's the first problem. But let's give Watchtower the benefit of the doubt here. Let's say that they're right, and Daniel chapter 4 does have 2 fulfillments, even though there's nothing in the book itself or the rest of the Bible to prove that claim. A second problem is that Watchtower snatches verses from all over the Bible to build their extrapolation that turns 7 times into 2,520 years. None of the context of any of the verses they reference so much as implies that they should be applied to Daniel's prophecy, much less stating so clearly. Each book is making its own claim about its own prophecy. If Daniel meant what Watchtower says it means, why didn't God have Daniel record these specifics in his prophecy, the way they're recorded in the other cited books? Why didn't God have the book of Daniel say that the 7 times represents 2,520 days, the same way Revelation says that 3.5 times represents 1,260 days? Why didn't God have Daniel include a day for a year in the same way that Numbers and Ezekiel do? Based on what is Watchtower applying these unrelated scriptures to Daniel's prophecy? And that's on top of the huge leap Watchtower has already made in claiming Daniel chapter 4 has a secondary fulfillment, because there's no scriptural evidence for that either. But wait, we're not done yet. There's more. Watchtower adds the 2,520 years to the year 607 BC. That's the year, claims Watchtower, that Jerusalem was conquered by Babylon and God no longer had a king representing him. The problem is, 607 is not the year that Jerusalem fell to Babylon. Jerusalem fell in 587 BC, 20 years later than Watchtower claims. Virtually all Bible scholars and archaeologists agree with this. Thousands of cuneiform tablets show this to be so. Nobody outside of Watchtower claims 607 as the year Jerusalem fell. Of course, Watchtower says that all of the Bible scholars and all of the archaeologists are wrong, so it's pointless to try and prove the correct 587 year to Jehovah's Witnesses using reliable scholarly sources. They reject those because Watchtower says they're all wrong, and Jehovah's Witnesses follow Watchtower blindly, and therefore they must all be wrong. So, we'll use Watchtower's own publications to prove that 587 is the year Jerusalem fell and not 607. Keep in mind that even though the years shown here are going up, we're actually going backwards in time. When dealing with BC years, the larger the number, the further back in time we are. First, Watchtower admits that Babylon fell to Cyrus the Great in 539 BC. Everyone agrees on this, including scholars and archaeologists. It then says that Nabonidus ruled Babylon for 17 years before it fell, which brings us to 556 BC as the start of his rulership. The king prior to him ruled Babylon for 9 months, which brings us back to 557 BC as his start. The king before him ruled 4 years, taking us to 561 BC. The one before him ruled 2 years, 563 BC, and finally Nebuchadnezzar ruled Babylon for 43 years, which means his rule began in 606 BC. The Bible book of 2 Kings says that it was in the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar's rule that Babylon conquered Jerusalem. If Nebuchadnezzar's rule began in 606 BC, which Watchtower's own publications show is the case, that means that Jerusalem fell 19 years later in 587 BC. Clearly, Watchtower is wrong about 607 BC being the year that Jerusalem fell to Babylon. Their own publications show them to be incorrect about that date. This matters because it means their 1914 calculation is also wrong. If you add 2,520 years to the actual date for the fall of Jerusalem to Babylon, you arrive at 1934, not 1914. Watchtower loves to correlate Jesus' rule beginning in 1914 with the start of World War I. They point to Revelation 12:9, where the great dragon is hurled out of heaven down to earth. Watchtower says that Jesus hurled Satan, the great dragon, down to earth after Jesus began ruling in 1914. With Satan confined to the earth, naturally he would be angry about it, and World War I is an expression of that anger and the start of the last days. So says Watchtower. But if you use the correct year for the fall of Jerusalem to Babylon, 587 BC, then the actual start of Jesus' reign would be 1934, assuming all the other pieces of the extrapolation are correct, which completely undermines Watchtower's correlation with World War I and Satan's anger. The last thing I want to point out here is that Watchtower is dishonest about how long they've been teaching that 1914 was the start of Jesus' presence and his rulership in heaven. In the September 15, 1998 edition of the Watchtower, it says that the Bible students in the 19th century anticipated that Christ would receive kingdom power in 1914. But that's simply not true, and Watchtower knows that's not true. Charles Taze Russell taught that Jesus' presence would begin in 1874, and that 1914 would be the year God's visible rulership would return to earth. It wasn't until 1930 that Joseph F. Rutherford, the second president of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society after Russell died, began teaching that 1914 was the start of Jesus' presence and rulership. Let's recap. To arrive at the 1914 extrapolation, Watchtower 1 claims Daniel chapter 4 has a second fulfillment in the fall of Jerusalem to Babylon, despite Daniel making no such claim, and even though Watchtower does not teach any of Daniel's other prophecies have a secondary fulfillment. 2. Watchtower uses a variety of unrelated scriptures to inform its extrapolation. 3. Watchtower wrongly claims that Jerusalem fell to Babylon in 607 BC, even though Watchtower's own publications demonstrate the correct year is 587 BC, which all scholars and archaeologists agree on. 4. Watchtower then adds its unfounded 2,520-year extrapolation to the incorrect year of 607 to arrive at its erroneous 1914 year. And 5. Watchtower dishonestly states that 1914 has always been the year that Watchtower has believed Jesus' presence and rulership began. Charles Taze Russell taught that it began in 1874, in the pages of the Watchtower magazine. Watchtower's methodology for this erroneous extrapolation actually originated with the Adventists, long before Charles Taze Russell picked it up. As far back as 1823, in John Aquila Brown's book, The Eventide, Daniel chapter 4 and the 2,520-year calculation appears. However, when 1914 failed to present God's visible rulership on earth, most Adventist groups realized that they were wrong, and that Daniel chapter 4 doesn't have a secondary fulfillment, thus they stopped referring to it. Watchtower, however, has for so long put so much of its religious capital into the year 1914 that to change it now would be a huge blow to its entire doctrinal foundation, which would no doubt cause even more mass exodus from the religion than is already occurring.